Afghanistan is viewed as one of the most conservative places in the world, and for good reason. Traditional forces within the country, whether religious or tribal, have dominated the direction Afghan society goes in. In the 1920s, however, the country was ruled by a modernist-inclined king hell-bent on westernizing his people's tribal psyche. Amanullah Khan was inspired by Europe's supremacy over much of the world and sought to remedy his nation's weak position by prescribing a litany of Western-inspired reforms. Having established himself as a Ghazi king after securing complete independence from the British, Amanullah would soon discover his biggest battle would be against his own people. His reforms would put him at odds with the vast majority of the nation, which increasingly lost patience with King Amanullah's repeated attempts to imitate the West. The ensuing battle between tradition and reform would in some way determine the fate of Afghanistan for the next 100 years. When the Iron Emir, Abdurrahman Khan, died in 1901, the Afghan throne was ascended peacefully by his son Habibullah. This was a stark departure from most successions, which heavily featured internecine conflict. Amir Habibullah's reign saw him benefit from his father's total domination of the country. His position was so secure that he could even afford to allow former foes of his father to return from their exiles. These returning families brought new ideas with them, and thanks to a modernist-inclined Amir in Habibullah, they were able to begin the modernization of Afghanistan. But Habibullah was not a fully independent ruler, as the British still controlled his foreign policy. Afghan nationalists chafed under this restriction, and when World War I began, made frequent attempts to involve Afghanistan in the war by attacking British India. Habibullah, however, was confident that he'd be rewarded with independence if he showed loyalty to the British, as he successfully maintained Afghan neutrality during the Great War. Finally, when the war was over in 1918, the British refused to free Afghanistan from the shackles of its colonial oversight. With this, his fate was sealed. He'd be assassinated just a few months later in February 1919 on a hunting trip. Many have since blamed his nationalist son and successor Amanullah for the assassination. Upon the death of the Emir, Sardar Nasrullah took his brother's place to rule. But Amanullah, who had stayed behind in the capital Kabul and was in control of the treasury, would depose his uncle just a few days later. Accusing him of complicity in his father's murder, Amanullah imprisoned his uncle Nasrullah, who was assassinated a year later in prison, likely on the orders of his nephew. The first order of business for the new Emir was to regain complete sovereignty from Britain. Knowing that the British would not simply give up on their control of Afghan foreign affairs, Amanullah determined it was time to go to war. His decision was made easier by the fact that there was a widespread national desire for independence. Not to mention, waging war on Britain would placate elements of the conservative status quo, who were unhappy with their new Emir for his modernist disposition and for the way he threw his uncle, the foremost conservative leader in the country, in prison. Therefore, war offered the prospect of uniting the nation against a common foe. And so, in his first royal proclamation, Amanullah vowed to lead his nation to total independence, a promise which was received very positively by his people. After Amanullah's letter to the Viceroy of India that proclaimed the independence of Afghanistan was essentially ignored, the Emir gave the order to invade British India in early May 1919. In the past, Afghan invasions of India had resulted in vast conquests and plunder. Amanullah had hoped for a wide-scale Pashtun rebellion from his fellow Pashtun brethren across the Durand Line in British India against their European colonizers. Some tribal support was forthcoming from the Waziris and Mahsuds, especially after the success of Nader Khan, the commander-in-chief of the Afghan forces and future king, who was able to capture the fortress of Tal across the frontier in British India. But the British, always on their toes for a tribal Pashtun uprising, had adequately prepared for this in the months leading up to the war and prevented large tribes such as the Afridis and Mohmands from mobilizing. After initial Afghan success, the British were able to neutralize the Afghan threat. The British had more men with better training and better weaponry. To the horror of the Afghans, they even bombed major cities like Kabul and Jalalabad. However, the British had finished fighting World War I and did not have the stomach for renewed conflict. In the face of stiff Afghan resistance and the almost perennial danger of an uprising among the Pashtuns on the frontier, the British found it expedient to be on peaceful terms with the Afghans. So when they approached with an offer of an armistice in late May, the British gladly accepted. Both sides claimed victory, but it's clear that the Afghans had more to cheer about in light of the fact that they had forced the mighty British to the negotiating table. Afghanistan, under its energetic foreign minister Mahmoud Tarzi, almost immediately began a vigorous campaign of establishing bilateral relations with various states, thus raising their political legitimacy in the international community. The British would only come to recognize Afghanistan's independence 2 years later. The Anglo-Afghan Treaty was signed in 1921 with the complete recognition from the British that Afghanistan was a sovereign and independent nation. But the Afghans had to pay a price. The Durand Line was upheld as the official border delineating the two states. Nevertheless, even the final agreement itself was considered to be a temporary arrangement. This has been a point of contention for Afghan irredentist claims to the present day. Regardless, Afghanistan held the enviable status of being one of the only independent Islamic countries at the time. Now that independence had been gained, Amanullah could get to work enacting his modernist vision on his country. To do this, he needed to shape the minds of young Afghans, so he focused heavily on educational reforms. Alongside a general expansion in the education system, the king set up 3 modern European language schools: Amaniya with its French instruction, Amani taught in German, and Ghazi was in English. Built in the capital Kabul, each one of them was modeled on the education systems of their respective countries. Amanullah's aim with these schools was to cultivate an intelligentsia which would go on to become an effective force for reform and modernization. Perhaps even more importantly, these schools would go on to provide the government with a source of able administrators that could fill the ranks of the ever-expanding bureaucracy of the state. One of the most interesting achievements from Amanullah's reign came in 1922, when he gave a 30-year monopoly on excavations to DAFA, the Franco-Afghan archaeological delegation. DAFA would go on to educate a generation of erudite Afghan scholars of the past through their archaeological findings, which were plenty. Excavations at Hadda in the 1920s, Surkh Kotal in the 1950s, Khanum in the 1960s and 70s all shed so much light on the Kushan Empire, Alexander's Greek successors that ruled Afghanistan, and most interestingly, Greco-Buddhism. This phenomenon of cultural syncretism, whereby Hellenist and Buddhist cultures merged, was centered in Gandhara, in present-day eastern Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan. Many of those same Afghans trained by DAFA would go on to fuse these discoveries with their nationalist sentiments, in the process creating a standardized national history for Afghanistan, the nation-state. Side note, this was the subject of my PhD. In the early years of his rule, Amanullah's reforms were not especially unpopular. But with the introduction of the Nizamnama constitution in 1923, Amanullah showed just how ambitious he was willing to be with his reforms. In it, he established equal legal status for all citizens, limited royal authority, and affirmed the supremacy of state law over tribal custom. For tribal leaders, the new constitution was unsettling to say the least. Their autonomy was clearly being targeted, as Kabul's authority was placed above centuries-old local authority. Religious leaders were also disturbed to see Sharia law was being subordinated to state law, a lot of which had been inspired by European judicial models. Both groups worried Afghaniyat, or Afghan identity, was being replaced by imported ideals. Within this context, even Amanullah's educational reforms began to be viewed with suspicion, as some parents worried their children could get alienated from Islam and tradition if they studied at state schools. At the same time, economic reforms further deepened these tensions. British subsidies had already ended upon independence, and a modern state required even more revenue. Amanullah's zealous quest to modernize meant he dramatically expanded government expenditure, funding schools, ministries, diplomacy, and the army. With the treasury strained, the state intensified taxation and tried to standardize tax collection across the country. Just like when his grandfather Abdurrahman Khan had attempted to do so, the imposition of taxes was deeply unpopular, especially to the Pashtun tribes who found this antithetical to their freedom-loving lifestyles. The fact that Afghans were being forced to accept the new taxes on them meant that economic demands became inseparable from the government's culturally coercive reforms. This intrusion was symbolized by the newly introduced Afghani currency, aimed at replacing a fragmented system of Kabul rupees, Indian rupees, Persian coins, and barter. Many merchants and rural communities distrusted the Afghani. All these pressures erupted in the 1924 Paktia uprising, when tribesmen in eastern Afghanistan rebelled against perceived attacks on Islam, conscription, legal reform, and taxation. Many felt they were being forced to choose between the ways they had always lived, guided by Sharia and Afghaniyat, and a new westernized model imposed from above. The uprising took almost a year to quell and required the full attention of the fledgling Afghan army. Needless to say, it exposed the limits of Amanullah's power and left deep scars. Subsequently, Amanullah had to delay some of his reforms to placate his people. His father-in-law and mentor Mahmud Tarzi had impressed upon him the need to move cautiously, to reform only when he had a strong and loyal army behind him, in the same vein as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. But the young king ignored this advice, and soon enough he would accelerate the pace of reform to breakneck speeds. In late 1927, from the British port city of Karachi, the now King Amanullah embarked upon a journey to Europe. Little did he know, this voyage would bring about his downfall. Going on to tour Turkey, France, Germany, Britain, and many other countries, Amanullah witnessed industrial societies firsthand. Not only was he impressed by their material modernization, Amanullah was mesmerized by their social advancements, the manner in which citizens followed the law and followed their civic duties for the betterment of their nation. In mid-1928, the 7-month journey came to an end with a visit to Turkey, where he spent time with the radical reformist Ataturk. In many ways, Amanullah was inspired by the Turkish leader's revolution, so it must have disappointed him to hear Ataturk cautioning him to exercise moderation and to be careful in his reform program. Regardless, he neither listened to Tarzi nor Ataturk, because when he arrived back in Afghanistan, he introduced a surge of drastic reforms, such as restrictions on the ulama's authority, Western dress codes, greater women's rights, and much more centralization. Afghans were shocked. What was once framed as Islamic renewal now revealed itself to be nothing more than a cheap imitation of Europe. Meanwhile, the economic strain intensified. With the new round of reforms, state expenditure rose even further. But because the new reforms alienated even more Afghans, tax resistance increased sharply as well. Amidst this instability, trade suffered. In 1928, Amanullah had shrewdly created the Bank-i Milli, the national bank, in order to centralize economic authority. Intended to reduce foreign dependence, it was internalized by many Afghans as yet another attempt by Kabul to reshape everyday life without consultation or consent. In November 1928, the Shinwari Pashtuns revolted and besieged the major eastern city of Jalalabad. In their manifesto of grievances, the Shinwari repeatedly attacked Amanullah's stance on women, which they viewed as foreign and unwelcome. Before long, the spirit of rebellion spread to the north, as the Tajik Habibullah Kalakani besieged Jabal Siraj, just north of Kabul. Seeing that his modern army was not strong enough, Amanullah reverted back to the age-proven tactic of calling upon tribal levies. The king was offered respite by his minister Loinab Ali Ahmad Shah Ghazi, who had pacified the Shinwaris diplomatically by the beginning of 1929. However, Kalakani was in no mood to let Amanullah off the hook. Although Kalakani's initial siege of the capital failed, Amanullah's authority was quickly falling into disrepute on account of his radical reforms. As a result, the idealistic king abdicated his throne to his brother Inayatullah Khan on January 14th. His brother followed suit just 3 days later when Kalakani entered Kabul victoriously. But the Afghan civil war was not over. The new Amir's authority was not well respected by most in the country, who viewed him as a usurper to the throne, derogatively referring to him as Bachey Sakhaw, son of the water carrier. After Amanullah's unconvincing attempt to reclaim his throne failed in May, Nadir Khan emerged as Kalakani's main rival. Nadir was a royal, being a descendant of both the Barakzays and Durranis. In addition to gaining the support of the British, Nadir quickly galvanized a number of Pashtun tribes to back his quest for power and promised to undo Amanullah's intrusive reforms. By October 1929, his forces had captured and sacked Kabul. Kalakani was executed the next month. Nadir Khan became Nadir Shah and established the Musahiban dynasty, who would serve as the last kings of Afghanistan. In short, Amanullah tried to compress generations of reform into a single decade without securing the social foundations necessary to sustain it. Whether some of these reforms were even compatible with Afghans is a separate story. Amanullah Khan correctly identified Afghanistan's vulnerability in a modern world, but he misjudged the pace at which a society rooted in tradition, autonomy, and religious authority could be transformed. His successors, the Musahibans, learned from his mistakes, favoring a more cautious reform program that prioritized material over social modernization. Regardless, Amanullah's legacy is alive and well amongst Afghans today, who remember him fondly for delivering independence to Afghanistan. As usual, I want to thank my Patreons for their generous support. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, peace!